Hi there, Lossien here, and today we're doing the last part of Sarah Sanderson, which means we're turning all this into this.
To cut my pattern, I started with the fold-over piece of the hood, using extra fabric from the hem of the skirt. I ended up unfolding the pattern piece and cutting two of them, and when I went through, I made sure that I marked the notch as well. Because I was using scrap fabric, the place on fold did not really work for me, so I just adjusted the pattern for that, to make sure I still got the pieces. I switched to my main cape fabric, made sure it was doubled over, and then placed my hood pattern on and cut it out. You can definitely use pins here. I don't, because I do a lot of cutting and I'm comfortable without pins. I also made sure to measure the neckline seam, because that has a huge influence on the rest of the cape. This ended up being 10 inches, so if you use the same pattern, it should be about 10 inches. To make the body of the cape, I ended up evening out the other side of my fabric, and then measuring from my neck to the floor, which in my case was 60 inches. I then marked this on the actual folded fabric, and then I took that and folded it in half. It ended up being the exact right amount, so that was perfection. And I evened out the top edge so that the extra bits from the hood was gone, and I had one very long rectangle. Since it was folded in half, I just cut along the bottom edge because my fabric was the same from the top to bottom, so I didn't have to worry about direction in that way. This also ended up giving me 4 lengths of fabric, or 2 folded lengths of fabric. On one side, I measured in 5 inches from the folded edge, and that was about half of that neck measurement. I went over to the other side, and from the selvage edge, the non-folded edge, I marked in another 5 inches. I then connected those 2 lines and cut them, giving me 2 folded pieces and 4 unfolded pieces, and a very, very full cape indeed. And the last thing to cut was the lace that goes on top of the cape. I kept the fabric folded in half and measured down 1/3 of my total height measurement, which was 60 in my case, so this ended up being 20 inches. And then I cut that into a separate piece so that it made it a little easier. I measured along one side in from both edges 5 inches, and then made a rough triangle shape, making sure that that last triangle left over was also 5 inches. And then I cut them apart and notched that center fold. And the last thing I did was just trimmed the very selvage edge to make sure it looked nice and pretty on the lace. I took those front hood pieces and gave them a quick press, and then I laid out my iron-on interfacing, cut it roughly to shape. I had to piece it because it wasn't quite long enough, and then ironed it down. I only did this to one side of the yoke piece because I really wanted it only a little stiff so it still had some movement when it switched between on her head and down. Once that was done, which was a bit time-consuming, I pressed the other side, making sure that both sides were nice and ironed, and then I trimmed all the extra interfacing off so it looked nice and pretty. And then it was ready to sew. The first pieces I sewed were the 2 yoke pieces, matching up those center points and sewing from that all the way out, making sure the good side was to the good side. I sewed all the way to the end and then flipped and sewed down that little edge as well. Then I started in the center again and worked my way out the other end. Doing the same thing, sewing along that long edge and then that little edge. I also trimmed the corners so that it could flip right side out. Next was the hood. Putting the fabric together wrong side to wrong side, I sewed all the way down the back, then trimmed the extra seam allowance nice and close to that stitching line, flipped it right side to right side, and sewed it again, making sure the new stitching line hid all the old stitching and extra seam allowance there. This meant it was a French seam and nice and clean on the inside when we opened it up, but still clean on the other side too. Next up was the lace. I started on the selvage edge and worked my way towards the fold, adding the pieces together, making sure that the smaller part of the triangle was at the top every time, and making sure that it was wrong side to wrong side. Once I reached the fold, I just worked my way back to the other side of the selvage, making a really long, almost semicircular piece of fabric. Once that was done and all the lace was sewn together wrong side to wrong side, I trimmed all my extra seam allowance, then folded it the other way so it was right side to right side and stitched each seam a second time, making sure that all the seam allowance was folded into that new stitch, making yet again more French seams and creating a fancy looking seam on both sides of the fabric so that if the top part of the cape moved around as we were shifting and taking photos, it still looked nice and pretty. For the main body of the cape, I took my 4 pieces with the selvage edge and sewed 2 and 2 together down that selvage edge itself, wrong side to wrong side, because eventually we will be turning these into French seams. This gave me 2 large triangles. I then placed those large triangles tops together, the small part of them, and wrong side to wrong side, and sewed down one edge, which gave me one very, very big triangle. The next step is to attach the folded triangles to either side of what we just sewed. What we do is unfold the triangle, place it wrong side to wrong side, and sew all the way down one edge. Then go to the other side of everything you've just sewn, and again, place it wrong side to wrong side, and sew all the way down that edge. So if you lay it out and look at it, you have the large folded piece, unfolded at this point, then all your small pieces, and then at the other side, your large unfolded piece again. And now we're just going to turn all these seams into French seams again. So we're going to trim all that extra seam allowance on every single seam, go back and re-sew each seam with right side to right side, and that means that we make sure that we can't see any of the seam allowance when we stitch it down again, so that every seam is nice and pretty. We do this so that when you see the inside of the cape, it still looks nice and clean, as well as the outside of the cape. It takes a bit of extra work, but it makes a huge difference. Since I wanted a nice clean finished edge on my cape, I decided to do a double fold on the edge of the selvage on both sides towards the wrong side of the fabric, just to give it a nice clean hem kind of finish. I ended up leaving the hem itself unfinished so I could distress it and make it look old, but I really liked that clean look towards the front on both sides. Then after that, I ran a quick basting stitch so I could gather it along the very top edge, so we could attach it to the hood itself. Back at the ironing board, we took a moment to flip that hood yoke right side out and give it a nice good press so that it had a nice clean edge, taking the time to make sure that it really was all the way out. Also gave the back seam of the hood a quick little press to make sure it was nice and pretty too. Then I pinned the yoke to the hood, right side to right side, starting at the center point where we had the notch on the yoke and where we had the notch on the hood. I pinned the side with the seam allowance all the way to the one edge from the center out, and the same on the other side from the center out. Only the side of the yoke with the seam allowance. Then I took it over to the machine to sew. I started at that center point and sewed all the way down one edge, attaching the yoke to the hood. Then I went back to the center point and did the other side all the way down. This made sure that the yoke was attached only on one side, because we're going to bring it back to the ironing board to make it nice and pretty and give us a nice edge again. Back at the ironing board, I knew we were going to look at the wrong side of the fabric for this. The very first step was to press the seam allowance that we just created towards the rest of the yoke. Then, we folded the yoke along that edge that we had already steamed and pressed a while ago, which gave us a nice folded in half fold. There was a bit of extra fabric over the seam we just sewed. This is what we folded under, just past that seam, and then pinned on the opposite side, the right side of the fabric. We're going to end up stitching it from the right side in that line between the two fabrics. It's called stitching in the ditch, and you want to make sure that it catches the fabric on the wrong side. So you fold that wrong side a little past. It sounds confusing, but once you start doing it, you start to get the hang of it. This way you don't see any stitching from the right side and only a little stitching from the wrong side. And we pinned it all the way across from both sides. I also took a moment to steam those center front lines so that they'd be nice and pretty. Because I like to do all my machine sewing at once, I decided to pin the body of the cape to the hood of the cape now. The next step was to pin the lace to the hood at center back, where we pinned, right side to right side, and then I pinned the body of the cape as well. Then I matched up the front edge, making sure not to get the yoke in that seam, again with the hood, then the lace, then the body. I went to the other side and did the same thing. Now, there was a lot of extra material for the body of the cape. This is where we used the gather. I had a bit of extra on the lace, so I just kind of pleated it by hand and pinned it so that it matched the same amount as the hood. The hood is your main measurement that we want to keep the same. Once the lace was pinned all the way across, it was time to gather in from that basting stitch we did on the body of the cape. I just kind of eyeballed it, wanting to make sure that my seams were towards the back, or at least at the 3/4 line. I evened out the gathering and pinned it all along, using the pins that I had already used for the lace and moving them up so that I could see every pin and not sew over my pins when it was time to sew. I repeated this on the other side, and we basically had an entire cape ready to sew. Just make sure that your right side is facing down on the body of your cape when you're doing this. You want to see those seams at this point. Then it was back to the machine to sew along that yoke seam. So, take your time on this one, because you want to go nice and slow and sew in between the two seams that you originally did, making sure that you're catching that fold of fabric underneath. You also want to take out the pins before you sew over them, because that can damage your needle and your machine and fly towards your face and be very, very bad. So take your time, always take your pins out before you go. You sew all the way across, and then it was time to sew the gathered part. Now this was fairly easy. I just had to take my time and make sure that all the gathers were laying flat and we weren't getting any extra bits. You want to make sure that none of the folds are coming up and over and it's going to look weird, so just take your time, sew all 3 layers together, and again, take your pins out before you sew over them. Never sew over pins. And sew all the way across, stopping just before the yoke. Then, just like always, we're going to trim all that extra seam allowance. I realized that I didn't want to see that in the inside of the neck, so once it was trimmed, I took an extra bit of fabric that I had left over from cutting out the hood, and on the bias, which is the diagonal, cut a nice about 1.5 inch, 2 inch strip, or 2 inch wide strip. That was more than the length of that neck measurement. I ended up having to sew 2 pieces together to make it long enough, but that's okay. Then I attached it right side to right side along the neck and sewed once again along that stitching line that I had just sewn. This may seem silly, but you want to make sure that all the extra bit is down towards the rest of your fabric, so that you have just the same amount of seam allowance that you just trimmed is your new seam allowance on this strip that you're sewing on. Because once it's sewn on, I folded it over twice on the other side to make sure that it fit all the way around, trim the extra bits off the ends, and then I ended up hand sewing this down. So all this does is creates a bound seam so that we had a nice, pretty looking seam on the inside and we didn't see all that seam allowance. You don't have to do it this way, I just found it the easiest way was to just fold that over twice and hand sew it all the way across. Now, hand sewing is fairly time consuming, so I highly recommend a podcast or something. Hashtag not sponsored, but I enjoy Critical Role. But whatever floats your boat. It's nice to have something on in the background because otherwise this just becomes very tedious. Once again, it was back to the ironing board for the second last step, and this is where we fold that yoke back to the good side of the hood and give it a really good press. So this is what ends up looking like the collar piece around her neck when the hood is down, and it's the whole like fancy folded edge when the hood is up. So we want to give it a nice hot press, not too hot, you don't want to make the fabric shiny or anything. My fabric was a wool, so I ended up using a wool setting and lots of steam, as you can see. And the very last step was attaching a hook and eye so that it could actually be on your body and closed. I ended up putting the hook and eye on the underside of the yoke, right at the center where the neck is. I chose the yoke because I like the way it looks and sits on me, and I just stitched it on the underside so you couldn't see it, so it was magically attached. Ta-da! So all in all, it's pretty good. I mean, she obviously had more than one cape depending on what she did with the cape in the film, so this is kind of the mix of all three as far as I can tell. Only thing I would have changed is used something other than this. Hers looks more like a dyed to match cheesecloth or something along those lines, and I had this on hand, so that's what I decided to do. So I hope you enjoyed coming along on this adventure with me, and we'll see you next time. Bye!
Mm-hmm.